Welcome to the Underline This podcast, the podcast where we unpack the big ideas hiding in between the margins, because the best parts, they're between the lines. This is going to be the best podcast we've done yet. Today, I'm going to be discussing The Life of Pi by Yann Martel. We'll start off with a book summary, talk about the author, we'll go into key themes, as well as my takeaways from the book. And we might also compare the movie versus the book as well. Let's kick things off. Let's talk about the book, Life of Pi. Life of Pi is about Pi Patel, a teenage boy from Pondicherry, India, who grows up curious about religion. Being in India, he embraces Hinduism. There's also Christianity and Islam in the mix. So between the three groups, he begins to study these simultaneously. And his family eventually decides to move to Canada, and they own a zoo, and they want to take their animals from the zoo with them on a cargo ship. Now, where the crisis happens within the story is on this journey. The ship sinks, leaving Pi stranded on a lifeboat in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with a Bengal tiger named Richard Parker, a hyena, a zebra, and an orangutan. Now, during this time, Pi is on a boat for 227 days. He struggles to survive, learning to fish, he has to collect water, and establish dominance over Richard Parker. And he does so by having to learn how to tame him. And again, Richard Parker is the name of the tiger. Now, eventually, Pi and Richard Parker wash ashore in Mexico. And it's here that Richard Parker, when they land, disappears into the jungle, never looking back. Towards the end of the book, when questioned by investigators, Pi tells a second, more brutal story where instead of talking about the animals that were on the boat, he actually uses humans and talks about how they committed acts of murder and cannibalism. And the officials end up choosing the animal story, and Pi leaves the reader to decide which is true. His recap of being on the boat with the animals or being on the boat and seeing humans behave like animals, which I think is fascinating. Now on to the author, Yann Martel. Yann Martel was born in Salamanca, Spain, in 1963. He's got Canadian nationality. He grew up in various countries, which include Canada, France, Mexico, and Costa Rica. The reason for this is that his father was a diplomat, so he traveled quite a bit. And as far as a career author, before Life of Pi, Martel published short stories and one novel called Self, but he was not widely known for that. And his motive for writing Life of Pi was that he wanted to explore faith, truth, and storytelling. And he often described the book Life of Pi as a story that will make you believe in God. It was partly inspired by his time in India, and there's actually a lot of knowledge. I would have thought that Yann Martel was actually Indian, just because there's so many details about Hinduism and culture within India that I noticed, and I feel like these are things that are not very common. These are not common knowledge, so props to him for doing very good research for this book. But he's partly inspired by India and by Moker Siliar's novel, Max and the Cats. Why? Because it also features a man in a lifeboat with a giant cat. And Martel acknowledged that this was a big influence, but built entirely different, more as an allegorical story. So there's our summary of the Life of Pi, as well as a recap of the author's life and his motives for writing the book. Let's talk about key themes. First, we have faith and belief. Pi embraces multiple religions. If you remember earlier, I mentioned that being in India, he came in contact with Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity. And it's interesting because the book suggests that choosing belief in God or in a story can make life richer. How is that? Well, my interpretation of this is that by choosing a religion or having beliefs in place gives you more purpose. I'm not saying that this is in all cases, but I'm just trying to make sense here. It really gives flavor, or as the Spanish like to say, sazon, to life, and it makes it more rich. It also gives you a feeling of control and also a lens for looking at the things around you, whether that be trials or even just like the little beauties of nature or even moments with more of an optimistic lens. Now, something that I really respect, and one thing I actually really like about the approach that Life of Pi takes is that Pi, because he really loves these three religions, he's not all in. He doesn't take that, what I would call like the typical mindset of investigating a religion. He hasn't forced himself into a construct. He's looking at each of these as kind of like a smorgasbord where he likes something here, so he's attracted to that. He likes something from Islam, so he enjoys that. And it's between these three religions that he goes to all three. I'm not sure if you want to call it like, trying to think of what you call when people get together in Islam, but I guess he goes to all three congregations because he enjoys it. Now, my question, just philosophically here, is like, what's wrong with picking from the smorgasbord? Now, I know that there are some contradictions in some of these religions if you were to try and do both. I don't think there's anything wrong with having respect and admiration towards multiple religions at the same time, or even picking and choosing what stands out to you as a truth or something that makes your life more fulfilling. For example, something that I really respect about Christianity is that it's a religion that promotes kindness and charity, as well as looking at challenges as something that helps you grow. I know that's not unique to Christianity per se, but for example, that's something that really stands out to me. Now, when it comes to Buddhism, one thing that I really respect about Buddhism is the truth of non-attachment, not getting attached too much to material things or even relationships, but just having balance and moderation. And I think that's something that can be learned from if you're a Christian as well. I don't think any religion necessarily has a monopoly on good ideas, but it's okay to pick and choose from them. And that's something that I really respect about this book. So Pi reflects that choosing the story with animals is like choosing belief in God, the quote, better story. And it's the one that gives life meaning. And just to kind of drive this home, something I really enjoy as well is that early on in the book, as Pi explains his fascination with why he enjoys Hinduism, why he loves Christianity and Islam, is that he's insisting that he just wants to love God in every form available, which I think is very beautiful. It's not necessarily that he's looking for the one that is best. He's just looking at different ways of being able to celebrate and love God. And that theme carries on throughout the story of just being able to find ways of loving God. And I think one moment of that later on is when Pi marvels at the beauty of the ocean and the mysteries of existence, seeing them as signs of the divine. Next up, we have survival and human nature. Now, the struggle to stay alive forces Pi to confront fear, violence, and hunger. How? Well, when you're stuck on a boat with dangerous animals, it definitely puts things into perspective. I love the proactive approach that Pi takes, where he is always thinking ahead. He's rationing. He's doing almost like a mental inventory of what he has, and he's using everything that he can to his advantage. And he takes action. And more importantly, he stays busy, which distracts him from despair. Now, one of the things that Pi also does is that he's doing his best to keep Richard Parker alive. And this is one of those purposes that help distract him. He's taming the tiger. And he also, at the same time, tames his own fear and despair. So here's some symbolism here where look at taming the tiger as taming one's fear. Next, we've got the power of storytelling. Stories can shape reality, especially when you look at yourself and you take on that alchemist, which I hope you listened to that podcast episode. I thought that was actually pretty good, where we look at ourselves as an ongoing development for a personal legend. That makes us the protagonist. It makes us take ownership of our lives. And really, the stories that we want to tell about ourselves, the way that we want to communicate, the way that we want people to look at our experiences, and looking at it as a way of storytelling, I think gives life pretty significant meaning. But ultimately, again, what the life of Pi emphasizes is that the better story is the one that you should pursue. So, for example, the better story may carry more truth than factual accounts. And reflecting, when I think about storytelling, sometimes you may not see the story in the mundane. I think at times when you look at maybe a bad day, or if you look at something that's going on or someone else's experiences, if you take a moment to reflect, it's almost like taking a sifting pan and throwing dirt in to find gold. And we can do this through our own experiences or through the experiences of others. Again, I like to think of that as iceberg theory, but let's call the iceberg theory, we've talked about that in other books as well, where it's when the story hints at deeper levels of meaning. So, for example, like Old Man in the Sea, it's not about just an old man going out and fishing and holding on to a fish for 3 days. It's about a story of struggle and survival and a triumph over the human spirit. And in this case, I think that when we do that for our own experiences, we can find a lot of more meaning. But again, key is taking the time to reflect. Next, we have coexistence of civilization and savagery. Now, Richard Parker symbolizes both danger as well as Pi's survival instincts. They coexist, but he doesn't underestimate what it is. So, for example, although Pi is looking at Richard Parker and he does tame him, he doesn't forget that this is a wild animal, and at any moment he could turn around and eat him. So I like that proactive approach of finding the balance of being able to coexist, but also just not forgetting about the real dangers in front of him. Next, let's talk about symbolism. Richard Parker, the tiger. Richard Parker represents Pi's primal survival instinct, the part of him that he must kill, dominate, and persist. Again, I see that as fear. Could even be death. And if you want to take this outside of the book a little bit more, if we all have our own Richard Parker, what are those fears are? And I think in this case, the life of Pi is supposed to be a metaphor for life, right? Where the tiger is always looming around us, and it's up to us to tame it so that we can continue to live and survive. But that is something that we all have to come to terms with. And that is what death is. It's something that is always looming around us. It's dangerous. But in order to survive and have a fulfilling life, we need to have that balance of having a respect towards it, but not letting it dominate us. Next, we have the lifeboat, which represents a microcosm of the world. It's isolation, struggle, and fragile balance. And I think the lifeboat is an excellent metaphor because let's just call our bodies our lifeboats. And if I might get a little philosophical here, I like this because the lifeboat really is something that we're learning to navigate. We're learning how we can survive and how we're navigating things that we do have control over versus those that we don't. And next, we'll go to the ocean. The ocean represents both vastness and spirituality, a reminder of human smallness before the divine. Now let's talk about the two stories. So just to remind everyone about what those are. The first story, the two stories represent the account that Pi tells the authorities when he's in Mexico. He's talking about how the first story that he tells them is one with the animals, right? Where he's got the zebra, the orangutan, the hyena, and Richard Parker. And when he tells that story, they almost look at it as like this is too good to be true. And then he tells a second account, which is a lot more brutal and probably more realistic, which is that he has these were actually real people, and the orangutan is his mom, and the hyena was a chef, and I can't remember who the zebra is, but essentially, like there's one point where the hyena is eating the leg of the zebra, and so that's why when you look at this from another lens of like, oh wow, actually maybe if it wasn't the animals, what does that mean? And it's a really bleak, really dark, really pessimistic view of what happened. And so those are the two stories, right? And in the end, the authorities end up believing the story with the animals. And so those represent a commentary on truth and belief. I mentioned before that we want to talk about the movie a little bit versus the book. Now, I have seen the movie. It's been a while since I've seen it. It came out a long time ago, I think in 2012. Of course, like with most movies, this is a lot more visual. And the visuals are pretty spectacular. There's a lot of CGI. There's bioluminescent oceans. There's flying fish and carnivorous islands. And the book, of course, leaves more to the imagination. Now, the tone between the two, the movie leans more heavily on spiritual awe and visual metaphor, while the book offers more philosophical reflection and inner monologue, which, of course, it seems to always be the case between books and movies. And then next, religion. The book goes a lot deeper into Pi's religious background and his practice of the three faiths. The movie goes through this pretty quick, which I get it. It's a movie. You got to keep things going. But at the same time, I feel like that's what makes this book so beautiful is looking at Pi, being able to get inside Pi's mind as he's looking and trying to make sense of the different beliefs around him and where he kind of finds a good middle ground for him. And then next we got the ending. So both essentially are accurate. They keep the two-story ambiguity, but the movie highlights Pi's emotional delivery of the truth more directly. Now, Richard Parker's departure. In the book, his sudden cold exit devastates Pi, and the movie makes it more emotional, with Pi narrating in tears. We're quickly coming to the end of this podcast. So let me talk about my takeaways. My first takeaway is that this book made me feel spiritually curious. As soon as I was done, I started looking at books that explored beliefs and religious systems. And I like the approach that Pi takes. Again, we'll call it the smorgasbord approach, which is looking, not necessarily trying to fit these into a frame or trying to fit oneself into a frame, but just looking at everything holistically and saying, oh, I like this. Like, I have a lot of respect for this, or I like that one too. And so exploring these different religions and being able to apply what maybe, like, for example, in Christianity and in Buddhism really drives the point of non-attachment, while Christianity has some truth there, right? But it's not front and center. And I think that is a very beautiful way of looking at life, is holistically, but specifically within like looking at beliefs and spirituality, looking at it holistically, and instead of looking at these as an all or nothing acceptance, just looking at picking and choosing and exploring it just to see, oh yeah, that's an idea that resonates with me. Let me apply that. Next is beliefs can provide a richer life. Looking at belief systems and looking at what's going on around you, it sometimes when you hear stories, parables, or things that are written down, or things that people believe, that when you look at real life, it makes you question, like, well, can man really do that? Did that really happen? I think taking the approach of, well, do those teachings, and does that give you hope? Like, I mean, no one at the end of the day really knows what's going to happen. We're all just kind of making educated guesses, and a lot of those guesses are based on what gives us more richness, more fulfillment, and more beauty. And I like that. Last takeaway that I have is that storytelling truly is an art, and it's a powerful teacher. For example, if you look at the great teachers in history, specifically religious teachers such as Christ, they spoke in parables. They used metaphors. And even looking at things today like marketing is much more powerful when there's a strong story behind it. I was watching Shark Tank the other day, and it's amazing to me when you look at someone who's pushing, for example, I was watching one about these revolutionary new mozzarella sticks. And of course, it'd be so easy just to look at this and say, yep, these are new mozzarella sticks. Here's how much we sell them for. Here's how much we did in revenue last year. But hearing the backstory makes it much more, it gives that product so much more meaning. And I think our lives are the same way. If we look at ourselves and tell our stories and live our life like it's a story, it just makes it that much more powerful and rich. Now, in conclusion, in the end, it's not about which story is true, but which story makes life more meaningful. And isn't that what we're all searching for? Like I said earlier, nobody's 100% certain about life's greatest questions, about why we're here, where do we come from, and where we're going. And because of that, we should acknowledge it, and we should show each other, including ourselves, some grace about our beliefs. We're all making calculated bets based on what gives us more fulfilling and a richer life. And sometimes the only way to, if I may wax poetic, by surviving the storms of life, is to believe in the better story that keeps us afloat. Faith isn't about proving facts. It's about choosing a way of seeing the world that gives us strength and helps us see more beauty. We all carry a Richard Parker, metaphorically speaking, within us. The wilderness we must learn to live with if we're going to endure. And maybe life is like Pi's journey, a fragile boat, a vast ocean, and the stories we choose to believe that guide us. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening to today's podcast. Please give us a follow on social media as well as wherever you get podcasts. Thank you again. We'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.